The universe, Elias Thorne had often thought, was far too loud. Not in the way a crowded street in Neo-Austin was loud, but in the way gravity groaned against the hull of a ship and the way stars screamed in the infrared spectrum. As a senior acoustic engineer for the Sol Federation, his job was to listen to the ghosts in the machine, the tiny shutters of metal that signaled a failing atmospheric scrubber or a hairline fracture in a fuel line. He adjusted his left earbud, a bulky custom piece of hardware that looked more like a piece of salvaged scrap than a medical device. It hummed with a low, grounding white noise, a necessary counterpoint to the hollow silence of his left ear. A freak decompression accident 7 years ago had stripped him of half his hearing, leaving him with a permanent, high-pitched ringing that felt like a needle pressed against his brain. "Give me a sit rep, you bucket of bolts," Elias muttered, tapping the console of the repair pod. The small craft, designated Echo 7, shuddered as it maneuvered around the primary relay of the Oort Cloud network. The AI responded in a voice as flat as a dead star. "System integrity at 94%. Diagnostics suggests a minor misalignment in the subspace resonator. Expected repair time is 42 minutes. Elias sighed, his breath fogging the interior of his visor. "Piece of cake. Let's get this over with so I can get back to my coffee." He stepped out into the void, the magnetic tethers on his boots clanking softly against the hull of the relay. Above him, the Milky Way was a smear of spilled milk across a black velvet curtain. It was beautiful, but to Elias, it was just work. He reached for his thermal welder, his movements practiced and efficient. He was 45 minutes into the job when the world decided to break. It started as a vibration in his marrow, a deep subsonic thrum that his sensors didn't pick up. His internal earbud began to screech, a feedback loop that made his vision blur. He looked up, and for the first time in his life, he saw space scream. A point of light, no larger than a marble, suddenly tore open into a jagged violet wound. It wasn't a black hole, but a harmonic tear, a rare spatial anomaly that resonated at a frequency so intense it could liquefy bone. The relay station began to disintegrate, the heavy reinforced steel twisting like wet paper. "Mayday, Mayday! This is Elias Thorne on Echo 7. I've got a massive singularity event in Sector 9. I'm being pulled in." Static was his only answer. The communication array had already been shredded. Elias scrambled back toward his pod, his fingers fumbling with the manual hatch. The gravitational pull was non-existent, but the acoustic pressure was immense. It was like being inside a giant bell that had just been struck by a hammer the size of a planet. The violet light engulfed the pod. Elias felt his teeth rattle in his skull. His custom earbud exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging his left side into a new, terrifying kind of silence. The fabric of reality seemed to glitch, the colors of the stars inverting into sickly greens and bruised purples. "Brace for impact," the AI chirped, its voice distorted, sounding like it was underwater. "Impact?" Elias had just enough time to think. "There's nothing to hit in the..." The pod slammed into an atmosphere that shouldn't have been there. Heat shields flared, turning the cockpit into an oven. Through the reinforced glass, Elias saw a world that defied every law of physics he knew. It was a planet of shimmering, translucent spires and oceans of liquid silver. The sky was a bruised lavender, lit by a sun that thrummed with a visible pulse. The pod screamed as it tore through the air, wings shearing off as it collided with a forest of crystalline trees. The sounds were overwhelming. Not just the wind, but the trees themselves, singing in a discordant, terrifying chorus as they were crushed. Elias hit the emergency release for the stabilizers, but the controls were dead. The last thing he saw before the world turned black was a massive, glowing green canopy rushing up to meet him and the distant, haunting sound of 1,000 glass flutes playing a single mournful note. When consciousness returned, it didn't come with light, but with vibration. Elias opened his eyes and immediately wished he hadn't. Every pulse of his heart felt like a drumbeat against his ribs. He was lying in a bed of what looked like moss, but it felt like velvet and hummed beneath his skin. The air was thick, carrying a scent of ozone and crushed mint. He reached for his head, his fingers trembling. His helmet was gone, cracked open like an eggshell. Amazingly, he could breathe. The atmosphere was rich, perhaps too rich, making his head swim with a dizzying oxygen high. "Are you zeroed out yet, Thorne?" he whispered to himself, his voice sounding strange and muffled in his own ears. He sat up slowly, his joints groaning in protest. He was in a clearing surrounded by trees that looked like they were made of spun glass. They didn't have leaves, they had delicate leaf-shaped bells that chimed softly in a wind he couldn't feel, only hear. Then he saw them. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him with wide, luminous eyes. There were perhaps a dozen of them, all women, their skin a pale, shimmering cyan that seemed to pulse with an inner light. They wore garments that looked like they were woven from liquid light, draped elegantly over bodies that moved with a fluid, haunting grace. One of them stepped forward. She was taller than the others, her hair a cascade of silver filaments that sparked when they touched her shoulders. She held a long, crystalline staff that vibrated with a low, comforting hum. "You have fallen from the silent sea," she said. Elias blinked. He didn't hear the words through his ears. He felt them in the back of his throat. It was a form of resonant communication, a translation of frequency into thought. I crashed," Elias managed, his hand instinctively going to his deaf ear. "Who are you?" "I am Lyra of the Resonant Vanguard," the woman replied. Her eyes, which were the color of a supernova, searched his face. "You are the echoless, the one the Matriarch saw in the vibrations of the Great Lattice." Elias frowned. "Look, Lyra, I'm just a guy who fixes radios. I don't know anything about a lattice or being echoless. I just need a way to call home." Lyra exchanged a look with the other women. A soft murmuring broke out among them, a sound like water rushing over pebbles. "Home is a ghost stream now, Starstruck," Lyra said, her voice softening. "You have arrived on Calith 4, and the Festival of Resonance begins tonight. If you cannot find your frequency, the world will tear you apart." Elias tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Lyra caught him, her skin feeling cool and humming with a gentle energy that made the pain in his head recede. For a moment they were close, and he could hear the melodic beat of her twin hearts. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound. "Steady, stranger," she whispered, her breath smelling of rare spices. "You're with the Zalari now. We don't leave our guests to rot in the dirt, but if you want to stay topside, you better learn to listen with more than just those damaged ears of yours." The city of Alindos was not built. It was composed. As Lyra led Elias through the winding pathways of the Zylari capital, he felt like he was walking through the interior of a massive, living musical instrument. The buildings were towering structures of resonant crystal, curved in ways that captured the wind and turned it into a low, harmonic drone that powered the city's bioluminescent lights. Everything vibrated. The ground beneath his boots, the handrails of the bridges, even the air itself. To the Zalari, this was the breath of life. To Elias, it was a sensory nightmare. "Can you turn the volume down on this place?" he asked, shielding his eyes from the pulsing light of a nearby plaza. Lyra glanced back at him, a flicker of amusement in her glowing eyes. "The city sings to welcome its new guest. Would you ask a heart to stop beating because the sound bothers you?" "Fair point," Elias grunted. "But I've got a literal industrial-grade headache." He noticed that they were attracting quite a crowd. The Zylari women, and he noticed there were almost no men among them, watched him with a mixture of reverence and intense curiosity. Some reached out to touch his flight suit, their fingers vibrating with a soft chime upon contact. "Why is everyone looking at me like I'm a prize-winning heifer?" he muttered. "You are a miracle of non-resonance," Lyra explained, leading him toward a massive domed amphitheater at the city's heart. "Our world is built on harmony. Every Zylari is born into a specific frequency. We are bound to the world and to each other by the Great Lattice. But you are a silence in the storm. You exist outside the song. Is that a good thing?" "To some, it is the sign of a savior," she said, her voice dropping to a serious tone. "To others, like the Frost Callers, you are a dissonance that must be erased." They entered the amphitheater, a space so large it felt like it had its own weather system. At the center sat an elderly woman on a throne of pulsing emerald. This was Matriarch Zola. Her skin was a deep, weathered indigo, and her eyes were clouded with age, but she radiated a power that made the very air in the room feel heavy. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pain in his left ear. The ringing, which had been a constant companion for years, suddenly shifted into a violent, screeching frequency. He saw Zola's hands move, weaving a pattern in the air, and realized she was using a massive acoustic amplifier to scan the room. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the rafters. Elias's engineering instincts, honed by years of detecting anomalies, screamed a warning. He didn't hear a sound, but he felt a shift in the air pressure, a sudden vacuum where there should have been a vibration. "Get down!" he yelled, lunging forward. He didn't think. He simply reacted. He tackled the matriarch just as a spear of dark, solidified sound, a sonic bolt, shattered the emerald throne, where her head had been a second before. The amphitheater erupted in chaos. The Zilari women screamed, a discordant wall of sound that made Elias's vision go white. He rolled with the matriarch, his body acting as a shield. He felt a searing heat against his back as a second bolt grazed his flight suit. "Security!" Lyra's voice cut through the din, a sharp, commanding note that stabilized the frequency of the room. Elias looked up to see a tall, pale figure leaping from the shadows. This was Von Kor. His skin was the color of a dead moon, and his eyes were pits of cold, gray ice. He held a device that looked like a jagged tuning fork, glowing with a malevolent violet light. "The outsider interferes," Von Kor bellowed, his voice causing the crystalline floor to crack. "He is a blight, a void in our harmony." Elias scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a strange weight in the air, a tension that seemed to center on him and the matriarch. Zola sat up, her indigo skin shimmering with a newfound intensity. She looked at Elias, then at the shattered throne, and then at the gasping crowd. A slow, deliberate smile spread across her face. "The first chord has been struck," she announced, her voice resonating through the entire city. "The Starstruck has claimed the matriarch. The bond link is forged." "Wait, what?" Elias said, his eyes widening. "I was just trying to stop him from zeroing you out." The crowd fell into a stunned, pregnant silence. Then a single woman in the front row began to sing a low, rhythmic melody. Another joined her, then another, until the entire amphitheater was vibrating with a joyous, overwhelming song. Lyra approached him, her face a mask of shock and something that looked suspiciously like admiration. "Elias, do you realize what you've done?" "I saved the boss lady?" he offered hopefully. "You saved her by initiating physical contact during the high resonance," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "In our law, that is the right of the balanced husband. By protecting the matriarch, you have claimed leadership of all the clans. You have won the mating ritual of the High Mothers." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the hundreds of beautiful, glowing women now bowing toward him. He looked at Von Kor, whose face was contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "I think there's been a massive misunderstanding," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I'm just an engineer. I don't do rituals. And I definitely don't do whatever this is." "Sacrilege!" Von Kor roared, stepping forward, his tuning fork humming with lethal energy. "You would hand our world to a deaf animal? I challenge the bond link. By the laws of the Frost Valleys, I demand the trial of the three notes." The matriarch stood, her presence silencing Von Kor's outburst. "The law is absolute, Von Kor. The Starstruck has acted where our own warriors froze. He has proven his resonance. If you wish to challenge him, you will do so at moonrise." She turned to Elias, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Her touch felt like a warm current of electricity. "Do not be afraid, Elias Thorne. You may be deaf to our world, but the lattice knows your name. Tonight you will learn what it means to truly lead." Elias looked at Lyra, who was now standing by his side, her hand resting on the hilt of her sonic blade. She looked at him with a gaze that was no longer just curious, but possessive. "Welcome to the family, stranger," she whispered, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I hope you're ready. Being the husband of an entire planet is a lot harder than fixing a satellite." Elias groaned, leaning his head back against a vibrating crystal pillar. 7 years of working in the quietest corners of the galaxy, and I end up as the king of noise. Just my luck. As the suns of Caliph Fours began to set, casting long, violet shadows across the city, Elias Thorne realized that his life as a simple engineer was officially over. He was a leader, a husband, and a target. And if he wanted to survive the night, he was going to have to start listening to the things he couldn't hear. The guest chambers of the Olindo Spire were less of a room and more of a living lung. The walls, made of a semi-translucent, pearlescent stone, pulsed with a slow, rhythmic violet light that matched the planetary heartbeat of Caliph IV. Elias Thorne sat on the edge of a bed that felt like it was woven from pressurized clouds, his head buried in his grease-stained hands. His flight suit was torn, his left ear was ringing with the fury of 1,000 angry wasps, and he had just been informed that he was technically married to the ruling elite of an entire alien civilization. "This is a grade A cluster of a situation," Elias muttered, his voice sounding hollow in the vibrating room. "One minute I am aligning a relay in the Oort cloud, and the next I am the poster boy for some intergalactic mating ritual. Just my luck." He reached into a pocket and pulled out the remains of his custom earbud. It was scorched, the delicate circuitry fried by the spatial anomaly that had dropped him here. Without the white noise generator to mask the tinnitus in his left ear, the world felt lopsided, a chaotic mess of sounds he couldn't quite process. A soft chime echoed through the room, not a sound but a sensation that vibrated through the floorboards and up into his marrow. The door, a curtain of shimmering sonic filaments, parted with a hiss. Lyra stepped inside, followed by two other women who moved with the same predatory elegance. One had skin the color of a deep ocean trench, her hair a stormy navy blue that seemed to flow even when she was standing still. The other was smaller, more delicate, with skin like sun-bleached coral and eyes that held the terrifying clarity of a high-powered microscope. "You look like a man waiting for his execution," Lyra said, her voice carrying that melodic, resonant quality that made Elias's teeth ache. "I have had better Tuesdays," Elias replied, squinting at them. "Who are your friends? And please tell me they are not here to discuss the guest list for the wedding." Lyra suppressed a smile, though her eyes remained sharp. "This is Alara, our chief harmonizer and healer, and this is Myra, the keeper of the resonance archives. They are here because the Matriarch has decreed that you must be prepared." "Prepared for what?" Elias stood up, his joints popping. "I am an engineer, not a gladiator. I fix things. I do not fight pale blue giants with tuning forks." Alara, the one with the ocean skin, stepped forward. Her fingers hovered just inches from Elias's left ear. He flinched, but she didn't touch him. Instead, he felt a warm, soothing vibration emanate from her palm. The piercing ring in his head softened, replaced by a dull, manageable hum. "Your frequency is fractured, Starstruck," Alara said softly. "Your left side is a void, a silence that creates a dangerous imbalance in your spirit. We must stabilize you before the trial. If you enter the lattice with this dissonance, the sound will not just defeat you, it will shatter your molecules." Elias sat back down, the relief of the dampened tinnitus making him feel lightheaded. "Listen, Alara, back home we call this being deaf. It is a bug, not a feature. I am broken. I am not some chosen one. I am just a guy who survived a crash." Myra the scholar leaned in, her eyes scanning his flight suit as if reading a blueprint. "Broken is a matter of perspective, engineer. On Caliph, we are all slaves to the song. We hear everything. We feel every vibration of the planet, every scream of the wind, every tremor of the earth. It is our strength, but it is also our cage. You, however, are shielded. Your silence is a fortress." She walked to a crystalline console in the corner and tapped a sequence of glowing runes. A holographic display projected a map of the planet's genetic history. It was a mess of jagged lines and failing frequencies. "Our people are dying, Elias," Myra said, her voice losing its academic coldness. "For 9 generations, our birth rates have plummeted. The few males born, like Von Kor, are born with a corrupted resonance. They are aggressive, unstable, and power-hungry. They believe the only way to save Caliph is to trade our resources to the Obsidian Syndics for genetic stabilizers." "Slavers," Elias spat. "I have heard of the Syndics. They are scavengers. They will strip this planet bare and leave you all in chains. Exactly, Lyra said, her hand moving to the hilt of her blade. Von Kor has already made his deal. He intends to use the trial of the three notes to seize the Matriarchy and open the gates to the Syndic fleet. You are the only obstacle in his path. Because you won the first right, you are the only one who can legally challenge his claim. So I am a speed bump, Elias sighed. A very confused, half-deaf speed bump. You are the echo-less, Ilara whispered. You are the only one who can stand in the center of the great lattice and not be driven mad by the pressure. To us, the trials are a test of endurance against the noise. To you, they might just be a walk in the park. Elias looked at the three women. They were beautiful, yes, but there was a desperation in their eyes that he recognized. It was the look of a crew on a ship with a failing oxygen scubber, staring at the only man who knew how to use a wrench. All right, he said, standing up and checking the seals on his boots. Give me the sitrep. What are these three notes I have to deal with? Lyra stepped forward, her silver hair sparking. The first is the trial of grace. You must navigate the resonance lattice, a field of high-frequency sound waves that will tear a normal person apart. The second is the trial of wisdom, where you must decipher the ancient song of the foundations. The third is the trial of strength, a combat ritual where Von Kor will try to liquefy your internal organs with his voice. Charming, Elias said. Does anyone ever actually survive this? Only the leaders, Myra replied, and only the ones who are truly in tune with the world. Well, Elias said, cracking his neck, I am about as out of tune as a piano dropped down a flight of stairs, but I suppose we better get to work. If I am going to be a husband to a whole planet, I should probably try to stay alive for the honeymoon. Lyra's eyes flashed with a sudden, playful intensity. Stay frosty, engineer. Von Kor won't just be bringing his voice to the arena. He has friends in high places, and they don't play by our rules. As they led him out of the chambers, Elias felt the floor beneath him tremble. It wasn't the city's heart anymore. It was something deeper, darker, the sound of a distant engine, a frequency that didn't belong on this world. The Syndics were already here, and they were hungry. The proving grounds were located 5 kilometers beneath the surface of Alindos, in a cavern so vast it had its own internal atmosphere. Huge pillars of violet crystal grew from the floor and ceiling, like the teeth of some prehistoric beast, each one humming with a distinct, vibrating tone. In the center of the cavern was the lattice. It looked like a sea of shimmering, dancing air. It was a complex grid of concentrated sound waves, visible only as a slight distortion of light, like heat rising off a desert highway. To the Xylari, who could hear the frequencies, it was a lethal maze of sonic blades. To Elias, it looked like a broken hollow projector. Von Kor was already there, standing on a platform of white stone. He had stripped off his heavy robes, revealing a torso of corded, pale blue muscle. He held his jagged tuning fork like a scepter, his eyes fixed on Elias with a look of murderous intent. The coward arrives, Von Kor's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the cavern. Tell me, outsider, can you even hear the sound of your own death? Elias stepped onto the opposing platform, his heavy work boots clanking against the stone. He had ditched his flight suit for a light, sleeveless tunic provided by Alara, though he had insisted on keeping his utility belt. He looked small and frail compared to the Xylari warrior, a monkey standing before a titan. I hear you just fine, Von Kor, Elias called back, his voice steady. You talk too much. In my world, the guys who bark the loudest are usually the first ones to run when the lead starts flying. Von Kor sneered. Your world is a graveyard of silence. Here, we are the masters of the air. Matriarch Zola stood on a high balcony, her indigo skin glowing under the light of a dozen floating lanterns. The trial of grace begins, she announced. Navigate the lattice. Reach the center stone. The first to touch the heart of the song survives. The other will be scattered to the winds. A thunderous note echoed through the cavern, and the lattice flared into life. Von Kor moved with the fluidity of a dancer. He leaped into the grid, his body twisting and turning as he navigated the invisible channels of sound. He could hear the blades of frequency, sensing where the air was safe and where it would slice through skin like a laser. He was fast, moving with a grace that was almost beautiful to watch. Elias, on the other hand, stood at the edge of the grid and hesitated. He closed his eyes. He didn't try to look at the distortions. Instead, he reached down to his belt and pulled out a small, handheld diagnostic tool he had salvaged from his pod. He had modified it with Alara's help, turning it into a visual frequency mapper. On the small screen, the lattice appeared as a series of red and blue lines. Red meant lethal, high frequency. Blue meant safe, low frequency. It was a topographical map of a nightmare. Elias took a breath and stepped into the grid. Immediately, the pressure hit him. It wasn't sound, not exactly. It was a physical weight, like stepping into a deep pool of water. His left ear began to throb, the silence there feeling like a vacuum that was trying to suck his brains out. "Keep your head on a swivel, Thorne," he whispered, just like a spacewalk. He moved slowly, his feet sliding across the floor. He didn't jump or flip like Von Kor. He walked with the deliberate, heavy steps of a man used to working in zero gravity, where every movement had to be calculated. He followed the blue lines on his screen, ducking beneath a wave of sound that would have liquefied his lungs, then sidestepping a pillar of resonance that was vibrating at 10,000 hertz. Von Kor was already halfway to the center, but he was slowing down. The lattice was changing, the frequencies shifting and becoming more complex. The warrior was sweating, his pale skin flushing a darker shade of blue. He was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the information hitting his senses. Elias, however, was in his element. This wasn't a ritual to him. It was a problem to be solved, an engineering puzzle made of air. He saw a gap in the red lines and surged forward, sliding under a low-hanging beam of sonic energy. He felt the heat of it pass over his back, smelling the singe of his tunic. "You're falling behind, big guy," Elias shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the cavern. Von Kor looked back, his eyes wide with shock. How was this monkey moving so fast? How could he ignore the screaming of the air? In a fit of rage, Von Kor struck his tuning fork against the floor. A wave of jagged, discordant energy ripped through the lattice, intending to disrupt the patterns and crush Elias. The shock wave hit Elias like a physical blow. He was knocked off his feet, his diagnostic tool skittering across the floor. He tumbled toward a red zone, a swirling vortex of sound that would shred him in seconds. "Elias!" Lyra's voice screamed from the sidelines, but it was drowned out by the roar of the lattice. Elias scrambled, his fingers clawing at the stone. He was inches away from the red zone. He could feel the air vibrating so hard his fingernails were starting to bleed. He reached out, his hand grasping a small outcrop of crystal. He looked up. Von Kor was laughing, his pale face a mask of triumph as he turned back toward the center stone. Elias didn't panic. Panic was for people who had oxygen to spare. He reached into his utility belt and pulled out a small, heavy magnetic puck, a tool used for securing lines to a hull. He looked at the diagnostic tool lying 3 meters away, then at Von Kor's feet. He threw the puck. The magnet slammed into the diagnostic tool, dragging it back toward Elias. At the same time, the magnetic field of the puck interacted with the sonic grid. For a fraction of a second, the frequencies around the tool neutralized, creating a small, safe bubble. Elias lunged, grabbing the tool and rolling back into a blue zone just as the red vortex collapsed. He didn't wait to catch his breath. He saw Von Kor reach for the center stone, his hand only a few inches away. Elias didn't try to outrun him. He looked at his screen. There was a massive high-frequency beam directly above the center stone, held in place by a series of resonant pillars. Elias didn't use his voice. He used his wrench. He threw the heavy metal tool with the precision of a man who had spent 10 years tossing parts to crewmates in a vacuum. The wrench struck one of the resonant pillars with a loud metallic clang. The pillar's frequency shifted. The delicate balance of the lattice shattered. The high-frequency beam above the stone collapsed, not on Elias, but on the path directly in front of Von Kor. The warrior was hit by a wall of sound so intense he was blown backward, his tuning fork flying from his hand as he hit the stone floor with a sickening thud. The cavern went silent. The lattice flickered and died. Elias Thorne walked forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached out and touched the center stone. It was cool and smooth, vibrating with a gentle melodic hum that felt like a purr against his skin. "The trial of grace is complete," Matriarch Zola's voice rang out, filled with a strange, tremulous hope. The starstruck has reached the heart. Elias didn't look at the crowd. He looked down at Von Kor, who was coughing up blue-tinged blood, his eyes unfocused. "That was a dirty trick," Von Kor wheezed, his voice a raspy shadow of its former self. "You broke the lattice." "I didn't break it," Elias said, wiping a smear of blood from his nose. "I just recalibrated it. You should learn to work with the tools you have, instead of just shouting at the world." Lyra was at his side in an instant, her hands checking him for injuries. Her skin was glowing so brightly it was almost blinding. "You did it, Elias. You actually did it." "I told you," he said, leaning on her for support. "I'm a good engineer, and sometimes it helps to be a little bit deaf when the world is screaming its head off." But as they led him away, Elias looked up toward the dark rafters of the cavern. He saw a flicker of movement, a red optical sensor that didn't belong to any Xylari. A drone. Von Kor wasn't just working with the Syndics. He was being recorded by them. "We need to move, Lyra," Elias whispered, his voice dropping to a serious, gritty tone. "The first trial was just the appetizer. The main course is coming, and I have a feeling it's going to involve more than just sound." She nodded, her expression hardening. "You're right. The Syndics don't like losing their investments. We need to get back to the Spire and prep for the next stage. Stay frosty, Elias. The wisdom trial is next, and that one requires more than just a wrench." Elias looked at his hands. They were shaking, but not from fear, from the resonance. He was starting to feel the world, starting to understand the patterns in the noise. He wasn't fixed, and his ear was still a silent void. But for the first time in 7 years, he didn't feel broken. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The journey had only just begun, and the silence was becoming his greatest weapon. Elias followed Lyra and her guards through the shadowed tunnels of the proving grounds, his mind already racing through the data he had seen on his frequency mapper. The Xylari were beautiful. Their world was a masterpiece of biological engineering, but they were vulnerable. They were too tuned in. They were like a radio with the volume knob stuck at 11, unable to ignore the static of the galaxy. As they emerged into the twilight of Alindos, the 3 moons were rising, their pale light reflecting off the crystalline towers. The city was quiet, but it was an uneasy silence. In the distance beyond the shimmering forests, Elias saw a streak of fire in the sky. It wasn't a falling star. It was a drop ship, sleek and black, landing in the territory of the Frost Valleys. "The Syndics," Lyra whispered, her hand tightening on her blade. "They are getting impatient." "Then let them come," Elias said, his voice cold and sharp as a piece of space debris. "I have spent my whole life fixing things that other people broke. I am not about to let a bunch of galactic scavengers ruin this world just because they want to make a few credits." Lyra looked at him, and for a moment, the warrior queen and the deaf engineer were perfectly in sync. "I think I am going to like being married to you, Elias Thorne," she said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. Elias laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Let's survive the next 2 trials first, Lyra. Then we can talk about the long-term contract." The 2 of them walked back toward the spire, their shadows stretching out across the glowing moss, 2 figures of dissonance in a world of perfect harmony, ready to face the storm that was coming for them both. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of the glass trees and the faint metallic tang of the approaching Syndic ships. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the vibration of the planet beneath his feet. He was ready. He was more than ready. He was an acoustic engineer with a grudge against the noise, and he was about to show Calith IV that sometimes the most powerful sound in the universe is the one you choose to ignore. As they reached the entrance of the spire, Ilara and Myra were waiting for them, their expressions grave. "The Matriarch wants to see you," Myra said. "The archives have revealed something, the prophecy of the Echo-less." It wasn't just about a leader. "What was it about then?" Elias asked. Myra looked at his left ear, her eyes filled with a strange, ancient wisdom. It was about a key to a door that has been locked for 10,000 years. And the only way to turn that key is with a heart that doesn't beat in time with the rest of the world. Elias Thorne looked at the moons, then at his own scarred hands. "I guess we're going to find out if I'm the right key for the job," he said. They disappeared into the spire, the doors of liquid light closing behind them, leaving the city of Olindos to hum its uneasy song under the watchful eyes of the stars. The trial of grace was over, but the trial of wisdom was just beginning, and Elias knew that this time he wouldn't just be fighting for his life. He would be fighting for the soul of a world that had forgotten how to be silent. The distance back to his quarters felt longer than the 3 kilometers it actually was. Every step was a reminder of the physical toll the lattice had taken on him. His muscles ached, and the phantom ringing in his ear was beginning to flare up again. When they finally reached the guest wing, Lyra turned to him. "Rest, Elias. Tomorrow the challenges will be even more taxing. Von Kor will not make the same mistake twice. He knows now that he cannot underestimate your silence." "I'll be ready," Elias said, though his voice was thick with exhaustion. "Just make sure someone brings me some of that green tea Alara has. It's the only thing keeping my brain from leaking out of my nose." Lyra nodded, her hand lingering on his arm for a second longer than necessary. "We will protect you, Starstruck. You are not alone in this." Elias watched her walk away, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light of the corridor. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a resonance that had nothing to do with sound. He was a long way from the Oort cloud, and the stakes were higher than any satellite repair he had ever handled. He stepped into his room, the violet light dimming to a soft, sleep-inducing glow. He lay down on the cloud-like bed, closing his eyes and letting the slow, steady hum of the planet pull him down into a deep, dreamless sleep. But even in his dreams, he could hear the sound of the black ships landing. He could hear the laughter of the syndics and the cold, sharp notes of Von Kor's rage. And in the center of it all was a small, quiet space, a fortress of silence that was the only thing standing between Caliph IV and the end of its song. Elias Thorne, the engineer who had accidentally won a world, was finally beginning to understand the price of his victory, and he was starting to realize that some things were worth the noise. The next morning, the city was different. The low, melodic hum was replaced by a sharper, more urgent vibration. It was the sound of a city preparing for war. Elias stood on his balcony, looking out over the spires of Olindos. He could see the movements of the Xylari guards, their glowing spears reflecting the light of the rising suns. He could see the healers preparing their resonance baths and the scholars poring over ancient texts. They were all waiting for him. He reached up and touched his left ear. It was still silent. It was still broken. But for the first time in his life, he didn't want to fix it. He didn't want to be like everyone else. He was the echo less, and that was exactly what the world needed. "Let's go see about this second note," he whispered to the wind. He turned back into the room, his movements sharp and purposeful. He grabbed his utility belt, checking each tool with the practiced ease of a professional. Wrench, diagnostic tool, magnetic pucks, thermal welder. It wasn't a warrior's kit, but it was his kit, and it had gotten him this far. He walked toward the door, the shimmering filaments parting before him. He was Elias Thorne, and he had a planet to save. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to make the universe a little bit quieter while he was at it. The journey to the Archive of Wisdom took them through the heart of the city's industrial sector, where the Xylari used sound to shape crystal and weave light. It was a place of intense, focused energy, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the sound of 1,000 high-pitched whistles. Lyra walked beside him, her expression grim. "The syndics have made contact with the council," she said. "They are offering a ceasefire in exchange for the Starstruck." "They want me?" Elias asked, a dry laugh escaping his throat. "What do they want with a half-deaf engineer?" "They want the key, Elias," Lyra said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "They know about the prophecy. They know that your resonance is the only thing that can unlock the ancient vaults. They don't want to buy our resources anymore. They want to take them all." "Well," Elias said, tightening his grip on his belt, "they are going to have to go through me first, and I am a lot harder to break than I look." Lyra looked at him, her eyes softening. "I know you are, Elias. That is why I am glad you are here." As they reached the archive, a massive structure of black, resonant stone, Elias felt a sudden, sharp vibration in the ground. It wasn't the planet, it was an explosion. He looked back toward the forest. A pillar of black smoke was rising into the lavender sky. The first drop ship had opened fire. The war has started, Lyra said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. Then we better finish these trials fast, Elias replied, because I have a feeling the third note is going to be a lot louder than we expected. They stepped into the archive, the heavy stone doors closing behind them with a final resonant thud. The darkness was absolute, lit only by the faint pulsing glow of the Xylari skin. Elias Thorne took a breath, his heart beating a steady, defiant rhythm in the silence of his own mind. He was ready for the wisdom, he was ready for the strength, and he was ready to show the galaxy that sometimes the most powerful thing you can be is a man who knows exactly who he is, flaws and all. The trial of wisdom was waiting, and Elias was done running from the noise. It was time to find the music in the silence. "I spent years thinking I was a mistake," he thought as he stepped into the darkness. "A glitch in the system. But maybe I wasn't the one who was broken. Maybe the system was just too loud to see the truth." The truth was that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of clarity. And in the heart of Calith IV, Elias Thorne was finally starting to see clearly. The interior of the Archive of Wisdom was a tomb of absolute crushing stillness. For a world that lived and breathed through the movement of air, this place was an anatomical impossibility. The black stone walls were carved from obsidian that had been treated with an ancient, forgotten polymer designed to absorb every stray vibration. It was a vacuum of sound, a place where a scream would die before it ever left the throat. To the Xylari, this was the ultimate trial of the mind, a sensory deprivation chamber that forced them to confront the terrifying emptiness of their own thoughts without the grounding hum of the Great Lattice. To Elias Thorne, it felt like home. "You okay, Thorne?" Lyra whispered, though her voice was barely a ghost of a sound, swallowed instantly by the thirsty walls. "I'm golden," Elias replied, his voice sounding flat and strange to him. "Honestly, it's the first time since I hit dirt that my head hasn't felt like it was in a trash compactor." Lyra shivered, her skin dimming to a dull, nervous gray. "I hate it here. It feels like being dead. How can you stand the silence?" Elias paused, looking at his hands in the dim bioluminescence. "I have had 7 years of practice, Lyra. When the universe stops talking to you, you learn to talk to yourself. Just keep your eyes on the markers. We don't want to get turned around in the dark." They moved deeper into the labyrinth, following a trail of faintly glowing runes that etched a path across the floor. The trial of wisdom wasn't a race, it was a deciphering. At the heart of the archive sat the Echo Mind, a biological supercomputer that held the collective history of Calith IV. To pass, Elias had to interface with it and answer the 3 questions of the Foundation. As they reached the central chamber, a massive sphere of liquid mercury-like substance suspended in midair began to ripple. This was the Echo Mind. It didn't speak in notes or songs. It spoke in pure, raw data, pulses of light and heat that translated directly into the brain's visual cortex. Suddenly, Elias felt a sharp, familiar tug in his left ear. Not pain, but a sensation of being plugged into a high-voltage line. The sphere flared a brilliant, blinding white. "Identity requested," a voice boomed inside Elias's mind. It wasn't Lyra's melodic resonance. It was a cold, mechanical rasp. Elias Thorne, Systems Engineer, Sol Federation. The sphere rippled violently. Species, human. Subtype, auditory impaired. Status, the echoless. "You are the anomaly predicted in the cycle of the 10,000th year." Lyra fell to her knees, clutching her head. The data dump was too much for her sensitive Xylari nervous system. The raw, unshielded information was like a physical weight pressing down on her. Elias, however, stood tall. His brain, already accustomed to filtering out the chaotic noise of his tinnitus and interpreting fragmented signals, processed the data with a cold, analytical clarity. "Question 1, the Echo Mind intoned. What is the source of the Great Decay?" Elias didn't guess. He looked at the streams of data flowing around him, genetic sequences, atmospheric charts, and historical logs of the Xylari ancestors. He saw a pattern that the Xylari, blinded by their own perfect hearing, had missed for centuries. "The source isn't external," Elias said, his voice ringing out in the silent chamber. "It's the song itself. You've tuned yourself so perfectly to the planet's resonance that you've lost the ability to adapt. Your DNA is becoming a closed loop. You're not evolving anymore. You're just echoing. You're literally singing yourselves to death. The sphere pulsed a deep, approving blue. Correct. Stagnation is the silent killer. Question 2. What is the price of the silence? Elias hesitated. He saw images of his own life. The accident, the years of feeling like a ghost in conversation, the isolation of being the only broken person in a room. He saw the archive's hidden logs, revealing that the Zeleri ancestors had once been like him, diverse, messy, and capable of living in the quiet. They had traded that diversity for the collective ecstasy of the lattice. The price is the self, Elias whispered. You traded your individuality for the harmony. Now when the harmony falters, none of you know how to stand alone. You've forgotten how to be individuals. Correct, the echo mind responded. Then the sphere began to change shape, stretching into a mirror-like surface. Elias saw himself reflected in the liquid metal, but his reflection was different. In the mirror, his left ear was whole. His skin was glowing with the cyan radiance of a Zeleri lord. He looked perfect. He looked powerful. Question 3, the voice said, and this time it sounded almost tempting, almost human. Do you wish to be whole, Starstruck? I possess the nanite sequences to repair your biology. I can grant you the true resonance. You would hear the stars. You would lead this world as a god, not an accidental husband. I can fix you, Elias Thorne. Elias stared at the reflection. For 7 years he had dreamed of this. He had spent every credit of his 35,000 marks in savings on specialists and experimental surgeries, all of which had failed. He had wanted nothing more than to hear the world again, to be normal. He looked at Lyra, who was still struggling on the floor, her body trembling from the perfection of the data around her. He looked at the memory of Von Kor, a man driven mad by the need for more power, more resonance, more perfection. If you fix me, Elias asked, his voice low and gritty, would I still be able to see the things I see now? Would I still be able to find the gaps in the noise? You would see as the Zelari see, the echo mind replied. You would be part of the song. Elias took a deep breath. He thought about the wrench he had thrown in the lattice. He thought about the way he had sensed the Syndic drone in the rafters when no one else had. He thought about the strength it took to survive the silence. That's a negative, Ghost Rider, Elias said, a hard, sharp smile touching his lips. Keep your nanites. I'm not broken. I'm just specialized. If I'm going to save this world, I need to be the guy who can hear what's wrong with the engine, not the guy who's singing along with it. The sphere erupted in a fountain of golden light. The pressure in the room vanished. Lyra gasped, her skin returning to its vibrant cyan. The trial of wisdom is concluded, the echo mind declared, its voice now possessing a strange, ancient warmth. The echoless has chosen the path of the bridge. He accepts the void to protect the sound. Go, Starstruck. The shadow fall is upon you. The walls of the archive began to vibrate, not with the city's song, but with something far more violent, a deep, mechanical thrum that Elias recognized instantly. It was the sound of orbital bombardment. Elias grabbed Lyra by the arm, hauling her to her feet. The trial is over, Lyra. We need to move. Right now. What happened? She asked, her eyes glassy. The Syndics, Elias said, pulling a magnetic puck from his belt and slapping it onto the stone door to force the mechanism. They didn't wait for the third trial. They're breaching the atmosphere. As the doors hissed open, the silence of the archive was replaced by a cacophony of screams and explosions. The violet sky of Alindos was choked with black smoke, and the crystalline spires were shattering like glass under a hammer. Situation normal. All fouled up, Elias growled, checking the charge on his diagnostic tool. Lyra, get your head on a swivel. The fancy rituals are over. It's time for some old-fashioned urban warfare. The 5 kilometers back to the spire were a descent into a literal sonic hell. The Obsidian Syndics weren't just using conventional explosives. They were using dissonance generators, massive tripod-like machines that plummeted from the sky and slammed into the ground, emitting a high-decibel, chaotic frequency that acted as a neurotoxin to the Xyleri. Everywhere Elias looked, the cyan-skinned women were collapsing. They weren't dying from shrapnel, they were being paralyzed by the noise. To them, the dissonance was like having their souls sandpapered. They lay in the streets, clutching their ears, their skin flickering a sickly, dying gray. Lyra was stumbling beside him, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. The generator 2 blocks away was pulsing a jagged, 300 hertz wave that made her weep blue tears. I can't, she gasped, falling against a shattered crystal wall. The noise! It's inside me, Elias. Elias felt the vibration too, a nasty rattle in his teeth and a pressure in his chest, but it didn't stop him. His broken hearing acted as a natural filter. His brain simply didn't register the full, agonizing spectrum of the dissonance. He was the only one in the street still standing upright. "Hold it together, soldier!" Elias barked, grabbing her shoulders. He reached into his utility belt and pulled out a pair of industrial-grade noise-canceling earmuffs, gear he had kept from his repair pod. He jammed them over Lyra's ears. "It won't stop the bone conduction, but it'll cut the air pressure," he said, his voice loud and commanding. "Look at me! Just look at my face! Follow my lead!" Lyra blinked, the muffling of the sound giving her just enough clarity to regain her feet. She looked at him with a mix of terror and awe. You aren't affected?" "I've had worse hangovers on Mars," Elias lied, though his heart was racing. "We need to reach the spire. If Von Kor is behind this, he'll be heading for the Matriarch." They turned a corner and ran straight into a squad of Syndic mercenaries. These weren't Xylari. They were hulking, multi-limbed reptilians in heavy, pressurized power armor. They carried sonic pikes and plasma carbines, moving through the paralyzed city like wolves in a sheep pen. "Contacts! 3 o'clock!" Elias yelled, shoving Lyra behind a fallen pillar. The lead mercenary leveled its carbine. Elias didn't have a gun, but he had a 30-centimeter heavy-duty titanium alloy wrench and a belt full of magnetic tools. "Cover me!" Elias shouted. He didn't wait for her to respond. He threw a magnetic puck at the nearest fountain, a structure of resonant crystal. As the puck attached, Elias tapped a command into his diagnostic tool, forcing the puck to emit a rapid-fire electromagnetic pulse. The EMP didn't hurt the mercenaries, but it interacted with the fountain's crystal structure. The fountain erupted in a directed, high-frequency scream that shattered the mercenaries' helmet visors. The reptilians hissed in pain, blinded by the exploding glass and the sudden auditory feedback in their comlinks. "Now, Lyra!" Elias yelled. Lyra surged forward, her warrior instincts overriding her pain. She moved like a streak of cyan lightning, her sonic blade humming a deadly sharp note. In 3 seconds, the mercenaries were down, their armor sliced open by a woman who was done being a victim of the noise. "Nice work, Lyra," Elias said, stepping over a fallen reptile. "Check their 6. Grab their comms if you can." They reached the spire 20 minutes later. The Great Hall was a shambles. The Matriarch's guards were scattered, incapacitated by a massive dissonance generator that had been planted right in the center of the room. Standing over the unconscious Matriarch, Zola, was Von Kor. He looked different. His chest had been ripped open and replaced with a glowing mechanical core, a Syndic tech heart that was pumping corrupted resonance through his veins. He wasn't just a warrior anymore. He was a walking, talking weapon of the Obsidian Syndics. Behind him stood a human, a man in a sharp gray suit that looked entirely too clean for a war zone. This was Director Thorne. No relation, Elias hoped, the regional head of the Obsidian Syndics. "You're late for the party, engineer," the director said, his voice amplified by a sleek collar. "I must say, your resistance to our equipment is fascinating. We might have to take you apart to see how you're wired." Von Kor turned, his gray eyes burning with a synthetic violet light. "The Echoless returns to die. You won the first trial through trickery, monkey, but there is no trick that can save you from the shadow fall." Elias stepped forward, his boots crunching on the glass shards. He looked at the dissonance generator, a black pulsing machine the size of a refrigerator. It was the source of the agony in the room. "You sold your soul for a shiny engine and a suit, Von Kor," Elias said, his voice cold. "You think you're the master of the world? You're just a battery for a corporation that's going to melt you down for scrap the second you stop being useful." Von Kor roared. The mechanical core in his chest flared. He raised his hand, and a wave of pure kinetic sound slammed into Elias, throwing him across the hall and into a crystal pillar. Elias felt a rib crack. He tasted copper in his mouth. The world spun, the silence in his left ear expanding until it felt like his whole head was underwater. He looked up. Von Kor was approaching, his hand glowing with a lethal charge. Lyra was trying to move, but the director had leveled a plasma pistol at her head. "Stay down, honey," the director sneered. "Let the boys finish their business." Elias looked at his utility belt. Most of his tools were gone, scattered by the impact. All he had left was a single thermal welder and his diagnostic tool. He looked at the dissonance generator. It was a sophisticated piece of hardware, but like all machines, it had a frequency, a resonance. "Everything has a breaking point," Elias whispered to himself, his fingers fumbling with the diagnostic tool. "You just have to find the right note." He tapped a sequence into the tool, overriding the safety protocols. He wasn't trying to map the sound anymore. He was trying to create a feedback loop. He set the tool to emit a specific, high-frequency pulse, the same pulse the Echo Mind had used to test him in the archive. Von Kor raised his hand for the killing blow. Elias jammed the diagnostic tool against the crystal pillar he was leaning on. The pillar acted as a massive tuning fork. The pulse from the tool shot through the crystal and into the floor, racing toward the dissonance generator. The generator hummed. Then it shrieked. The Syndic tech wasn't designed to handle the raw, ancient frequency of the Echo Mind. The machine began to vibrate violently, its internal dampeners failing. "What are you doing?" the director screamed, his calm facade breaking as the floor beneath him began to liquefy. "I'm changing the station," Elias yelled. The generator exploded in a spectacular burst of blue energy. The dissonance stopped instantly. The effect on the room was immediate. The paralyzed Xylari guards gasped, their strength returning as the poison left the air. Lyra didn't hesitate. She disarmed the director with a single fluid kick before he could fire. Von Kor, however, suffered the most. His mechanical heart, tuned to the dissonance, began to backfire. He collapsed, clutching his chest as the corrupted resonance tore through his nervous system. You broke it," Von Kor wheezed, his pale skin turning a bruised, necrotic purple. "No, Von Kor," Elias said, dragging himself to his feet and wiping the blood from his chin. "I just reminded you what happens when you try to force a song that doesn't belong to you." The matriarch Zola stood up, her indigo skin glowing with a fierce, ancient light. She looked at the fallen warrior, then at the captured director, and finally at Elias. "The trial of strength has begun," she whispered, her voice carrying through the restored harmony of the hall. "But it is not a battle of muscles. It is a battle for the soul of Calith." Elias looked out the shattered windows. The Syndic ships were still in the sky, and more drop ships were descending. The city was still burning. "We haven't won yet, Matriarch," Elias said, his voice hard. "We've just bought ourselves a 5-minute head start." He looked at Lyra, who was standing at his side, her blade bared. She looked at him with a new kind of intensity, not just as a husband or a prophecy, but as a leader. "What's the move, Elias?" she asked. "The move," Elias said, grabbing a discarded sonic pike from the floor, "is that we stop playing defense. You said there's a vault under this city, a weapon." "The Echo Driver," the matriarch said, "but it requires 2 keys, one of pure resonance and one of absolute silence." Elias looked at his scarred hands, then at his deaf ear. "I think I know where we can find both." But as they prepared to move, a massive boom shook the entire spire. A Syndic cruiser had moved into a low-altitude hover directly above the palace. Its main cannons were glowing red. Director Thorne laughed, even as Lyra held a blade to his throat. "You think one engineer can stop a planetary acquisition? We've invested 40 billion credits in this world. We aren't leaving without our return on investment." Elias looked at the director, then up at the hovering ship. 40 billion, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with a dry, dangerous humor. "Well, I hope you kept the receipt, because I'm about to file a very loud complaint with your home office. The cost of their perfection was being laid bare in the fire and the smoke. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the Xylari weren't just singing a song of mourning. They were listening to a man who knew that sometimes the only way to save the music is to be brave enough to change the tune. The humanistic theme of acceptance was no longer a philosophical debate. It was the only thing keeping them alive. Elias Thorne, the man who was broken, was the only person on Calith or 4 who could look the end of the world in the eye and not blink. Because when you've already survived the silence of your own life, a little bit of noise from a Syndic cruiser doesn't seem so scary after all. The shadow fall was here, but in the heart of the spire, a new kind of light was beginning to burn. A light fueled by the strength of a man who finally realized that his greatest flaw was actually his greatest weapon. Elias turned to Lyra. "Let's go find that vault. We've got a planet to save, and I'm parked in a no-loading zone." They ran toward the depths of the spire, the sound of the Syndic cannons echoing above them, a rhythm of war that Elias Thorne was finally ready to conduct. "Wait," Lyra said as they reached the elevator. "If we activate the echo driver, what happens to you?" The archives said the silent key must absorb the feedback. Elias didn't answer right away. He just checked the seal on his utility belt. "Don't worry about me, Lyra. I've got a very high tolerance for static. Just keep your head on a swivel." "We're almost there." The elevator descended, plunging them back into the dark, quiet earth, leaving the burning world behind for a moment of desperate, final clarity. The trial of wisdom had given him the answers, but the trial of strength was going to require everything else he had left. 40 billion credits, Elias whispered to himself, a small, sad smile on his face. "Man, I really am in the wrong line of work." But as the doors opened to the ancient crystalline vault, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The silence was waiting, and it was time to turn the key. The lift dropped like a stone through a well of velvet darkness. Elias Thorne felt the pressure change in his marrow, a heavy, sinking sensation that made the skin on his arms crawl. Beside him, Lyra stood with her eyes closed, her cyan skin glowing with a rhythmic, frantic pulse. She was listening to the world above, the sound of her home being torn apart by the obsidian Syndics. Every explosion, every discordant wave from the dissonance generators seemed to strike her like a physical blow. "Stay with me, Lyra," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp in the small space. "We are almost at the floor." She opened her eyes, and for a second the warrior queen was gone. In her place was a terrified woman whose entire reality was vibrating out of tune. "It feels like the planet is screaming, Elias. Not just the people, the rocks, the air, the very bones of Calith. It is a mass of white noise. I cannot find the anchor." Elias reached out and took her hand. His skin was rough, calloused from years of mucking about with heavy machinery and high-tension wires. To his surprise, his touch seemed to steady her. She leaned into him, her glowing silver hair brushing against his shoulder. "That is why I am the pilot on this trip," Elias said. "I am used to the static. Think of me as the soundproofing." The lift hit the bottom with a muffled thud that Elias felt more than heard. The doors, made of the same liquid light filaments as the ones in the spire, didn't hiss open. They dissolved. They stepped out into a chamber that defied every law of architectural logic Elias had ever studied. It was a cavern of impossible proportions, at least 3,000 meters across, shaped like the interior of a massive inverted bell. The walls were lined with millions of crystalline shards, each one angled to catch and redirect sound toward a central spire that rose from a lake of liquid mercury. This was the echo driver. It was a piece of terraforming technology so advanced it bordered on the divine. It didn't use fuel or electricity. It used the rotational energy of the planet and the tidal forces of the 3 moons to create a standing wave of pure, concentrated resonance. It was the heart of the world, and it was currently silent. "Beautiful, isn't it?" A voice echoed from the shadows. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively going to the heavy titanium wrench at his belt. From behind a cluster of resonance-dampening pillars, Director Thorne stepped out. He was alone this time, his sharp gray suit dusty but his composure still sickeningly intact. He held a small black device in his hand, a detonator. "You just don't know when to quit, do you, Director?" Elias spat. "The city is burning. Your mercenaries are being chopped up by the city guard, and you are standing in a basement." The director laughed, a cold, clinical sound that didn't belong in this sacred space. This isn't a basement, Mr. Thorne. It is a vault. And I am not quitting. I am simply waiting for the locksmith. He gestured toward the central spire. My people have been trying to hack the interface of the Echo Driver for 3 months. We used every supercomputer in the Syndic fleet. We tried to force the harmonics with dissonance generators. Nothing worked. The machine is keyed to a very specific set of biometrics. He looked at Elias, a predatory gleam in his eyes. It needs a duality. It needs the highest peak of xylary resonance and the deepest valley of silence. A perfect circle. Elias felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. You knew. You let me win the trials. You let me reach the archive. Oh, I didn't let you, the director said, tapping his temple. I encouraged you. Von Core was a blunt instrument, a useful distraction to keep the Scilery busy while you proved yourself to be the Echoless. And now, here you are. The key. He raised the detonator. My men have planted enough charges in the spire above to collapse the entire mountain. If you don't step onto that platform and activate the driver for me, I will bury this city and everyone in it. Lyra snarled, her sonic blade humming to life. You would destroy the very resource you came to steal? Resources can be mined from rubble, the director shrugged, but I would prefer the machine intact. It is worth more than 10,000 systems. Imagine a weapon that can liquefy an entire population without scratching a single building. That is what the Echo Driver is, a planetary reset button. Elias looked at the spire, then at Lyra. He saw the pain in her eyes, the way she was struggling just to stay upright in the heavy, pressurized air of the vault. He looked at his own hands, the scarred, half-deaf engineer who had spent his whole life trying to fit into a world that was too loud. He remembered the Echo Mind's offer in the archive. It could have fixed him. It could have made him whole. If he had taken that offer, he would be as vulnerable as Lyra right now. He would be just another Xylari, paralyzed by the resonance. But he hadn't. He had chosen to be broken. And in that moment, Elias realized that his deafness wasn't a flaw. It was a specialization. He was the only man in the galaxy who could stand at the center of that machine and not have his brain turned into jelly by the feedback. All right, Director, Elias said, his voice steady. You want the machine turned on? I will turn it on, but you are going to regret the playlist. Elias, no. Lyra cried out, reaching for him. It will kill you. The feedback from the silent key is a total auditory vacuum. It will rip the air out of your lungs. Elias turned to her, a small, sad smile on his face. Stay frosty, Lyra. I have been practicing for this my whole life. He walked toward the central platform, his boots clanking against the crystalline bridge. The air grew thicker with every step, the pressure mounting until his vision began to blur. He could feel the resonance of the planet trying to find a home in his body, a chaotic, thrumming energy that wanted to vibrate his cells apart. He reached the console, a simple, smooth surface of black obsidian. There were 2 indentations, one for a hand and one for an ear. Elias looked back at the director, who was watching with bated breath, the detonator clutched in his trembling hand. You think you are so smart, Director, Elias called out. You think you can control everything because you have the biggest bank account and the loudest guns. But you forgot one thing about engineers. What's that? The director shouted back. We don't just fix things, Elias said, his fingers hovering over the console. We also know exactly how to break them so they can never be fixed again. Elias slammed his hand onto the black stone. At the same time, he pressed his deaf left ear against the resonant indentation. The world didn't explode. It didn't scream. It went absolutely, terrifyingly silent. The silence was not a void. It was a wait. For Elias Thorne, the moment his skin touched the Echo Driver's interface, the rest of the world vanished. He couldn't hear his own heartbeat. He couldn't hear the air rushing into his lungs. He was submerged in a deep, pressurized ocean of nothingness. In the center of his mind, a single point of light appeared. It was the frequency of the planet, the primal song. It was beautiful, a complex, shifting tapestry of harmony that held everything together. But there was a tear in the tapestry, a dark, jagged hole where the dissonance generators and the syndic greed had ripped through the fabric of the world. Elias reached out with his mind. his engineering brain seeing the tear not as a disaster, but as a faulty circuit. He needed to bridge the gap. He needed to be the wire. The feedback hit him like a physical blow. Because he was the silent key, the machine was using his lack of hearing as a grounding rod. The sheer volume of the planetary resonance was being channeled through his body, filtered by his silence, and then projected back out as a purified wave. It was agony. Every nerve ending in his body felt like it was being scorched. His vision turned red, then black, then a blinding, crystalline white. He could feel the mercury in the lake below beginning to rise, responding to the change in frequency. He heard a voice, not with his ears, but with his soul. "Why do you stay?" the echo mind asked, its voice echoing in the silence of his mind. "You are the echo-less. You could let the sound consume you and be at peace. Why do you fight for a world that is not your own?" Elias gritted his teeth, his fingers digging into the obsidian console. Because it is a good song," he thought back. "And I am a gearhead. I don't like seeing things out of tune." He pushed back against the pressure. He didn't try to fight the noise anymore. He didn't try to mask the tinnitus or ignore the void in his left ear. He embraced it. He opened himself up to the silence, letting it become a vast, empty vessel. He realized then that he had spent 7 years mourning the man he used to be. He had been so focused on what he had lost that he never saw what he had gained. He had gained the ability to stand in the storm and not be moved. He had gained a perspective that no one else in the universe possessed. He wasn't a broken man. He was the only man who was whole enough to handle the silence. The echo driver flared. A pillar of pure golden light erupted from the spire, punching through the ceiling of the vault, through the 5 kilometers of rock, and into the sky of Olindos. Above ground, the effect was instantaneous. The golden wave rolled across the city like a tide of liquid sunlight. It touched the paralyzed Zalari, and their skin began to glow with a renewed, vibrant cyan. It touched the dissonance generators, and the Syndic machines simply disintegrated, their dark frequencies neutralized by the planetary song. The Syndic mercenaries in the streets screamed as their power armor began to vibrate at a frequency that shattered the metal like glass. The dropships in the sky lost their lift, their engines failing as the air itself refused to carry them. In the vault, Director Thorne watched in horror as his detonator turned to dust in his hand. The black stone of the vault was glowing, the resonance so pure it was beginning to hum with a sound that felt like a blessing. "No!" the director screamed. "This is 40 billion credits. You can't just throw it away." He pulled a backup pistol from his coat, but before he could aim, Lyra was on him. She didn't use her blade. She used the resonance. She let out a single high-pitched note that resonated with the director's internal organs. He collapsed, clutching his stomach, his face turning a sickly, pale white. "It was never yours to buy, Director," Lyra said, her voice sounding like a choir. She turned to the platform. "Elias, break the link. It is too much for you." Elias was barely conscious. He was floating in a sea of golden light, his body feeling weightless. He could see the whole planet now. He could see the forests of glass, the silver oceans, and the millions of Xylari women looking up at the sky. He could feel their hope, their relief, and their love. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't Lyra's. It was the Matriarch Zola, though she wasn't physically there. Her image was projected through the lattice, her indigo skin radiant. "You have done it, Starstruck," she said softly. "You have tuned the world." Elias tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Is it fixed?" "It is more than fixed," the matriarch replied. "It is reborn, but the price of the silence must be paid. You cannot remain the echo-less forever." "What do you mean?" "The machine has taken your silence, Elias. It has filled the void." Suddenly, the golden light retracted. The pressure in the vault vanished. Elias fell away from the console, his body hitting the crystalline floor with a heavy thud. The silence was gone. Elias lay there, gasping for air. He felt a sharp, stinging pain in his left ear. Then he heard a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic drumming. Thump, 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 thump. He realized with a start that it was his own heart. Then he heard a footstep, the clack of a boot against stone. He heard a breath, a ragged, sobbing breath. "Elias?" The voice was like a melody he had been trying to remember his whole life. It was rich, warm, and filled with a depth of emotion that made his soul ache. "Lyra," he whispered. He turned his head. Lyra was kneeling beside him, her face wet with blue tears. She was beautiful, more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. And for the first time in 7 years, he could hear her with both ears. The echo driver hadn't just used his silence, it had healed it. The ancient nanite sequences within the machine, triggered by his total acceptance of his flaw, had rebuilt his auditory nerve, tuning it to the planetary resonance. You can hear me?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. Elias sat up slowly, his head spinning. "I can hear everything, Lyra. I can hear the Mercury Lake. I can hear the wind in the tunnels. I can hear you." He looked around the vault. The director was being led away by a group of Xylari guards who had descended from the spire. Von Kor was nowhere to be seen, likely buried under the rubble of his own ambition. The battle was over. The Syndics were retreating, their fleet crippled by the planetary pulse. Olindos was safe. Elias looked at his hands. They were still scarred. He was still a 34-year-old engineer with a dry sense of humor and a tendency to fix things that weren't his. But something had changed deep inside him. He wasn't fighting the world anymore. He was part of it. He realized then that the lesson wasn't about being perfect. It was about understanding that every scar, every flaw, and every moment of silence had a purpose. If he had never been deaf, he never would have been the echoless. If he had never been the echoless, Caliph IV would be a dead rock. His brokenness had been the very thing that saved an entire race. Lyra reached out and touched his left ear, her fingers gentle. "It is a new song, Elias, for all of us." Elias took her hand and kissed it. "It's a pretty good one," he said, a genuine smile finally breaking across his face. "But I think I'm going to need some help with the lyrics." They stood together in the center of the vault, the golden glow of the echo driver fading into a soft, steady hum. The planet was at peace, and for the first time in a very long time, so was Elias Thorne. As they walked back toward the lift, Elias looked at the obsidian console one last time. He saw the imprint of his hand and his ear, a permanent record of the moment the silence had been turned into music. "We have a lot of work to do," Lyra said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The city needs to be rebuilt. The other clans need to be united. And the Matriarch is already planning the official ceremony for the bond link." Elias groaned, but there was no bite in it. "More rituals? Really?" Lyra laughed, the sound like silver bells. "You are the king of Caliph, Elias. You better get used to it." "Well," Elias said as the lift doors closed, "I suppose it's a better gig than fixing satellites, but I am definitely taking a vacation after the wedding. Somewhere quiet." Lyra smiled and squeezed his hand. "I think we can arrange that, my starstruck." They ascended toward the surface, toward the light and the noise and the beautiful, messy future of a world that had been saved by a man who was brave enough to be quiet. The humanistic theme had moved from the shadows to the heart of the action. It wasn't just a story about a crash landing or an alien war. It was a story about the strength found in vulnerability and the power of accepting one's own nature. Elias Thorne had come to Caliph IV as a man who felt like a ghost, but he was leaving the vault as a man who finally knew the value of his own voice and the value of his silence. The cost of his transformation had been high. He had faced his greatest fear, suffered unimaginable pain, and nearly lost his life. But in return, he had found a home, a family, and a purpose. He had learned that the universe doesn't make mistakes. It just makes different kinds of music. And as the lift reached the spire and the doors opened to the cheering crowds of Olindos, Elias Thorne took a deep breath, listened to the beautiful, chaotic song of the city, and finally, for the first time in his life, he didn't want to change a single note. The suns of Caliph IV rose with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, painting the shattered spires of Olindos in shades of bruised peach and molten gold. For the first time in 10,000 years, the city was not singing. It was breathing. The frantic, high-pitched mechanical shriek of the dissonance generators had vanished, replaced by the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of thousands of Xylari women working together to clear the rubble. Elias Thorne sat on a jagged outcrop of resonant crystal, watching a salvage crew haul a blackened Syndic dropship out of a collapsed plaza. His hands were covered in blue dust and grease, his knuckles raw from 12 hours of manual labor. Beside him, his old titanium wrench lay in the dirt, a humble tool that had somehow survived a planetary reset. "You're staring again, Thorne." A voice melodic and warm drifted into his awareness. Elias turned. Lyra was standing behind him, her silver hair braided back for work, her cyan skin glowing with a soft, revitalized light. She looked exhausted, but her eyes held a clarity he had never seen before. "I'm just getting used to the acoustics," Elias replied, his voice still feeling a bit too loud in his own skull. "Every time a piece of metal hits the ground, I hear the harmonic overtones. It's like the whole world is a giant equalizer, and I'm the only one who can't find the mute button." Lyra sat down beside him, her shoulder brushing against his. "The echo driver didn't just fix your hearing, Elias. It tuned you. You're hearing the world as it actually is, not just the parts that are loud enough to ignore." "I'm a gearhead, Lyra. I'm used to binary. On or off. Broken or fixed. This is like trying to read a blueprint while someone is playing a symphony on top of it," Elias said, rubbing his eyes. He took a deep breath, savoring the scent of ozone and crushed mint that still lingered in the air. "How are the others?" "The Matriarch is resting," Lyra said, looking out over the city. "She says the lattice is healing faster than she expected. The birth cradles in the lower sectors are already showing signs of stabilization. The genetic degradation, it's reversing because of you." "Because of the machine," Elias corrected. "I just happen to be the guy with the right kind of silence to turn the key." Secondary characters, once paralyzed by the noise, now moved with a new sense of purpose. Ilara, the healer who had once looked at Elias as a fractured anomaly, was now leading a team of Xylari in a resonance bath ritual for the wounded. She stopped and looked up at the spire, her eyes meeting Elias's from across the distance. She didn't bow, she simply nodded, a sign of respect between equals. She realized that the void she had feared in Elias was not a lack of life, but a different kind of strength, one that had anchored her people when their own music had become their cage. A commotion near the edge of the plaza drew their attention. A group of Xylari guards was escorting a line of prisoners toward the transport lifts. At the front was Director Thorne, his gray suit ruined, his face a mask of bitter, silent fury. He looked at Elias, his eyes burning with the resentment of a man who had lost 40 billion credits to a man he considered a glitch. Elias stood up, dusting off his trousers. He walked toward the line of prisoners, his movements steady and purposeful. The guards stepped aside, allowing the two men, the corporate predator and the accidental king, to face each other. "I hope you enjoyed the show, Director," Elias said, his voice flat and gritty. "I imagine the board of directors is going to have some very interesting questions about your return on investment." The director sneered, his lip curling. "You think this changes anything, engineer? The Syndics are a galaxy-wide conglomerate. This planet is just one line on a ledger. We'll be back. And next time, we won't bother with the local customs. We'll just slag the whole rock from orbit." Elias leaned in close, so close that the director could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. A side effect of the echo driver's resonance. "You won't be back, Director, because I'm going to spend the next 6 months uploading every byte of data I found in your encrypted files to the Sol Federation High Court. Your illegal genetic tampering, your slave trading contracts with Von Corps, the whole 9 yards. You aren't going back to a board meeting. You're going to a maximum security cage in the Ceres belt." The director's face went pale. You can't have that data. Our encryption is military grade." Elias tapped his temple. "Your encryption is based on prime number algorithms. I spent 10,000 years, well, it felt like it, inside a machine that thinks in 5-dimensional harmonics. Your firewalls were about as effective as a screen door on a submarine." He stepped back, gesturing to the guards. "Take him away. He's polluting the frequency." As the director was led off, Elias felt a strange sense of peace. He wasn't the same man who had crashed here. He had spent 34 years feeling like he was a few steps behind the rest of the world, a man trying to catch a train that had already left the station. But in the silence of the vault, he had realized that the train didn't matter. He was the tracks. Von Corps was being treated in a separate facility, his mechanical heart removed and replaced with a temporary stabilization unit. He would survive, but he would never lead again. He would spend his life as a reminder of what happens when you try to sell the soul of a world for the sake of power. Later that evening, Elias found himself back in the archive of wisdom. The liquid sphere of the echo mind was quiet now, its surface a calm, silver mirror. "You returned," it intoned, its voice no longer a cold rasp but a gentle hum. "I had a question," Elias said, sitting on the cold obsidian floor, "about the prophecy." The sphere rippled. "The echoless was always meant to come, but the choice was always yours. You could have been the master of this world or its savior. You chose to be its bridge." "Why me?" Elias asked. "Out of all the people in the galaxy, why a half-deaf engineer from a backwater colony? Because a man with perfect hearing would have been too busy listening to himself to hear the planet," the echo mind replied. "You were the only one who knew how to value the quiet." Elias looked at his reflection. He saw a man who had been through a war, a man who had lost his home but found a purpose. He realized that for 34 years he had been trying to fix his hearing so he could be like everyone else. He had thought that being whole was the goal, but being whole wasn't about having all the parts. It was about knowing how to use the parts you had. He walked out of the archive, the heavy stone doors closing behind him. The city of Alindos was beginning to glow again, a soft, steady cyan light that pulsed with the heartbeat of the people. Elias took a deep breath, and for the first time, he didn't try to filter the sound. He just let it wash over him, a chaotic, beautiful, and perfectly imperfect song. 2 years had passed since the day the sky over Calith IV had burned. The rebuilding of Alindos was nearly complete. The crystalline towers had been regrown, their structures now reinforced with a new type of architectural geometry that Elias had designed. A blend of human structural engineering and xylari resonance. The city was stronger now, less brittle, and more capable of absorbing the shocks of the galaxy. Elias Thorne stood in the central workshop of the New Harmony Institute. He was 36 years old, and he looked every bit the part of a man who had found his place. He was wearing a modified xylari tunic over a pair of rugged work trousers, his tool belt still sagging with the weight of his trusty titanium wrench and several new glowing devices of his own invention. He was currently working on a harmony bridge, a small handheld device designed to help xylari children who were born with oversensitive hearing. It was a bridge between the intense resonance of their world and the quiet they needed to grow. A small girl, no older than 5, sat on the workbench, her cyan skin flickering with curiosity. Her name was Rin, and she was one of the first of the new generation, children born with a more balanced genetic code, capable of hearing both the song and the silence. "Is it ready, Father Elias?" she asked, her voice like the chime of a silver bell. "Almost, Rin," Elias said, his fingers moving with a precision that was now second nature. "I just need to calibrate the low-frequency dampeners. We don't want the planet's heartbeat to be too loud when you're trying to sleep." He tapped a sequence into the device, and it emitted a soft, warm glow. Rin took it, her eyes widening as she held it to her ear. She smiled, a bright, radiant expression that made Elias's heart ache with a sudden, overwhelming joy. "It's quiet," she whispered, "like the stars." Elias patted her head. "That's the idea, kiddo. Sometimes the best part of the song is the space between the notes." He watched as she hopped off the bench and ran toward the door, where Lyra was waiting. Lyra had become the high commander of the unified clans, a role she handled with a grace and ferocity that had made her a legend across the planet. She looked at Elias, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "She's becoming more like you every day," Lyra said, walking over and leaning against the workbench. "She's already asking how the magnetic pucks work." Elias laughed, a rich, deep sound that resonated in the workshop. "God help us all. A Zalari warrior with an engineering degree. The galaxy isn't ready for that." Lyra took his hand, her skin glowing with a deep, contented indigo. "We are ready, Elias. The first trade ship from the Sol Federation arrives tomorrow. Real trade, not the syndic kind." Elias nodded. He had worked hard to establish a diplomatic relationship with his old home. Calith IV was no longer a secret, nor was it a victim. It was a sovereign world, a member of the Galactic Convergence, and its primary export was no longer raw crystal, but the philosophy of resonance. They walked out onto the balcony of the Institute, looking out over the sprawling city. The three moons were rising, their pale light reflecting off the silver oceans. In the distance, the Echo Driver stood like a silent guardian, its golden spire reaching toward the stars. Elias leaned against the railing, the wind ruffling his hair. He could hear the city singing, not a forced, perfect harmony, but a complex, shifting melody that allowed for discord, for change, and for growth. It was a human song as much as a Xylari one. He closed his eyes, taking a moment to just be. He thought about the man he had been, the engineer who had spent his life fixing broken machines because he felt like a broken machine himself. He realized that he had spent 36 years looking for a cure, only to find that he was the medicine. For 36 years, I looked at my life through the lens of what was missing. I saw the silence in my left ear as a hollowed-out room, a place where the world couldn't reach me. I thought I was a glitch in the human design, a piece of hardware that had been zeroed out before its time. But standing here, looking at the lavender sky of Calith, I finally see the blueprints clearly. That hollowed-out room wasn't a defect, it was a buffer. It was the only space in the entire galaxy quiet enough for the truth to resonate. We spend so much of our lives trying to patch our scars and smooth over our rough edges, thinking that perfection is the only way to be worthy. We chase a harmony that has no room for the crack in the bell, but I've learned that the crack is exactly where the light gets in, or in my case, where the song finds its anchor. My broken parts didn't just save this world, they gave me a way to understand it that a perfect man never could. We aren't defined by the things we've lost, but by what we choose to build in the space they left behind. My silence wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary, and now that it's filled with the music of this world, I realize I wouldn't trade a single second of that quiet for 1,000 years of easy hearing. Lyra rested her head on his shoulder, her breath a warm, rhythmic presence beside him. "What are you thinking about, Elias?" "I was just thinking that I'm glad I crashed," Elias said, his voice soft. "I was so busy trying to fix a communications satellite that I forgot how to actually talk to people. It took a whole planet of blue women and a sonic war to remind me how to listen." Lyra squeezed his hand. "You were always a good listener, Elias." Even when you couldn't hear, the two of them stood there in the twilight, a man from Earth and a woman of Calith, two notes in a song that was still being written. The galaxy was a big, loud, and often terrifying place, but Elias Thorne wasn't afraid of the noise anymore. He knew that as long as he had his tools, his family, and his silence, he could handle anything the universe threw at him. He looked out at the stars, wondering if there were other broken people out there, looking up at their own skies and feeling like they were missing a piece of the puzzle. He wanted to tell them that they were wrong. He wanted to tell them that they were exactly what they were supposed to be. "I used to think my scars were just reminders of everything I'd failed to protect, but now I know they were the key to everything I was meant to become. So I have to ask you, what is the one thing about yourself that you've been trying to fix because you think it makes you less? What if that very thing is the only part of you that can save your world?" Elias Thorne reached out and picked up his old titanium wrench, the metal cool and familiar in his grip. He didn't put it back in his belt. Instead, he held it up to the starlight, a small, humble symbol of a man who had stopped trying to be perfect and started being useful. Then with a quiet, confident smile, he turned and walked back into the light of his home. The three moons of Calith IV continued their eternal dance, casting long silver shadows across the world that had finally found its voice in the heart of a man who knew the value of the quiet.